Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Alaska State Trooper Frank Morrison had driven the Dalton Highway more times than he could count, but the radio call that came through on that February morning in 2023 would haunt him until his dying day. Mile marker 127, near the remote Yukon River crossing, where temperatures hadn't risen above -30 in 2 weeks, and the aurora borealis painted the endless night sky in sheets of green and gold that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly intelligence that had witnessed the coming and going of civilizations across millennia of Arctic silence. The trucker who made the call was barely coherent, his voice shaking so badly that dispatch had to ask him to repeat his report 3 times. His rig was idling on the shoulder, exhaust creating clouds of steam in the brutal cold, while he stood outside in conditions that could freeze exposed skin within minutes, staring at something that had shattered his understanding of human nature and left him incapable of forming coherent sentences about what he'd discovered in the pristine snow beside Alaska's most dangerous highway. "There's bodies in the snow," he kept saying, his words punctuated by the chattering of teeth and the kind of deep, shuddering breaths that come from shock and terror. "Jesus Christ, there's so many bodies in the snow. They're arranged in a circle, like some kind of ritual, like someone wanted them found this way." Morrison had been patrolling Alaska's most dangerous highway for 12 years, long enough to know that the Dalton wasn't just a road. It was a 414-mile lifeline through some of the most hostile territory on Earth. Built to service the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, it stretched from Fairbanks to Deadhorse through country that could kill you in a dozen different ways. Temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, wildlife that viewed humans as either threats or prey, and isolation so complete that help might be days away even if you could reach it through the static-filled radio communications that plagued the northern regions where cellular towers were as rare as trees, and twice as precious. The highway carried a unique mix of traffic that reflected Alaska's complex relationship with its natural resources and the outside world. Pipeline workers making the dangerous journey to Prudhoe Bay for shifts that lasted weeks in conditions that tested human endurance. Truckers hauling supplies to the oil fields through weather that could turn deadly without warning. Tourists seeking adventure in one of North America's last genuine wildernesses. And always, lurking beneath the legitimate traffic, the smugglers who used the highway's isolation and limited law enforcement presence to move contraband across international borders that existed more as lines on maps than barriers to determined criminals. Morrison had dealt with smuggling operations before. Drugs moved from Canadian sources to distribution networks in Anchorage and Fairbanks. Illegal weapons transported across borders with minimal customs oversight. Even occasional cases involving exotic animals or cultural artifacts stolen from indigenous communities. But he had never encountered anything like the scene that awaited him at mile marker 127, where the discovery would launch the largest criminal investigation in Alaska State Trooper history and reveal the existence of an operation so sophisticated and ruthless that federal agencies would struggle to comprehend its scope and methods. The drive to the scene took Morrison through landscapes that exemplified both the beauty and hostility of Alaska's interior. Endless expanses of tundra stretched toward mountain ranges that disappeared into low-hanging clouds pregnant with snow. The few trees that managed to survive in the harsh climate stood like sentinels, marking the slow transition from the boreal forests of central Alaska to the Arctic tundra that characterized the North Slope. It was country that humbled human ambition and reminded travelers that survival depended on respect for forces that had shaped the landscape long before humans had developed the technology to challenge them. But nothing in Morrison's experience patrolling the Dalton had prepared him for what he found at mile marker 127. 17 bodies, arranged in a perfect circle around what appeared to be the remains of a makeshift camp. Men, women, even 3 children who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, all frozen solid in the Alaskan winter with expressions of terror and desperation that the cold had preserved with grotesque perfection. Their clothes suggested they weren't local. Light jackets inappropriate for Arctic conditions, sneakers that would have provided no protection from the snow and ice, clothing designed for climates where winter meant temperatures in the 40s rather than the -40 conditions that characterized Alaska's interior during the deepest months of winter. The arrangement of the bodies was too precise to be coincidental. They formed a perfect circle with geometric accuracy that suggested the use of surveying equipment or mathematical calculation. Each body was positioned exactly the same distance from the center point, facing outward as if they had been arranged to watch for approaching threats that never materialized in time to save them from whatever fate had befallen them in this remote location where screams would carry no further than the wind that swept across the tundra without obstacle or mercy. The camp itself told a story that made Morrison's blood run cold, despite the layers of winter clothing that protected him from the Arctic conditions. Expensive camping equipment that had been deliberately destroyed rather than simply abandoned. Tents slashed open with systematic precision, their contents scattered across the snow in patterns that suggested methodical searching rather than random vandalism. High-quality cold weather gear that had been cut apart and rendered useless, leaving its former owners vulnerable to conditions that would kill within hours once their protection was compromised. Supplies that should have sustained a group for weeks had been scattered and abandoned. Canned food scattered across the snow, water containers cracked open and frozen solid, camp stoves and heating equipment smashed beyond repair. But most disturbing was the evidence that the destruction had occurred while people were still alive to witness it, forced to watch as their means of survival were systematically eliminated in a demonstration of power that served no purpose beyond inflicting psychological torture on victims who were already trapped in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. In the center of the circle, a fire pit filled with what looked like identification documents, all burned beyond recognition except for fragments of foreign passports and currency from countries Morrison couldn't identify. The burning had been thorough and deliberate, designed to eliminate any evidence of the victims' identities or origins while leaving enough fragments to suggest that their nationality was important to whoever had orchestrated their deaths. The passport fragments that survived the fire suggested victims from multiple countries, partial text in languages Morrison recognized as Spanish, Russian, and what might have been Arabic or Farsi. The currency included denominations that appeared to be from Central American and Eastern European countries, suggesting that the victims had traveled enormous distances to reach this remote location where they had met their deaths under circumstances that challenged every assumption about criminal behavior and human nature. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. Morrison radioed, his breath forming clouds in the -40 air while aurora borealis flickered overhead like cosmic indifference to human suffering. "I need every available unit, the medical examiner, and federal backup immediately. We've got a mass casualty situation at mile marker 127, and this is definitely not natural causes. I'm counting 17 bodies arranged in what appears to be a deliberate pattern, with evidence of systematic destruction of survival equipment and identification materials." The response came through static-filled radio communications that reflected the challenges of law enforcement work in Alaska's remote regions. The nearest backup was over 200 miles away. Driving conditions were hazardous due to blowing snow and visibility limited to a few dozen feet, and the medical examiner would have to be flown in from Fairbanks, weather permitting. Morrison was looking at hours of alone time with 17 frozen corpses and evidence of criminal activity that exceeded anything in his experience or training. The investigation that followed would reveal a smuggling operation unlike anything law enforcement had encountered in Alaska or anywhere else in North America. The victims weren't tourists who had gotten lost or experienced travelers who had underestimated the dangers of the Dalton Highway. They were paying customers of what appeared to be a human trafficking network that used the remote highway as a corridor for moving people across international borders without detection, but with a twist that challenged every assumption about criminal motivation and the economics of illegal immigration. Harold Kowalski, the lead investigator from the Alaska Bureau of Investigation, arrived by helicopter 12 hours after Morrison's initial call, bringing with him crime scene specialists and federal agents whose expertise in human trafficking cases would prove inadequate for understanding the sophistication and cruelty of the operation they were about to uncover. Kowalski had seen his share of smuggling operations along Alaska's vast border with Canada, but this case would challenge his understanding of criminal psychology and human nature. The forensic examination of the scene revealed details that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The victims hadn't died from exposure. They'd been killed before being arranged in their circle and left to freeze. Small caliber gunshot wounds, carefully placed to avoid obvious signs of violence that might be visible to casual observation, suggested execution-style killings carried out with professional precision and planned in advance, rather than opportunistic violence or robbery gone wrong. But the execution wounds weren't the only evidence of systematic violence. Each victim showed signs of prolonged abuse, healed fractures, malnutrition, and scarring that suggested weeks or months of captivity and systematic torture before their final transportation to the death site beside the Dalton Highway. Someone had been holding these people prisoner for extended periods, subjecting them to conditions that gradually weakened their physical condition while documenting their deterioration for purposes that remained unclear. The camp had been staged to look like an amateur operation that had gone wrong due to inexperience with Arctic conditions. Cheap camping equipment that would never have protected anyone from the brutal cold, supplies that were inappropriate for the climate and terrain, and evidence of poor planning that might explain why unprepared travelers had died from exposure in one of North America's most hostile environments. Even the fire pit had been carefully constructed to burn hot enough to destroy documents while leaving enough fragments to suggest the victims had tried to keep warm before succumbing to the elements. The staging was sophisticated enough to potentially fool investigators who weren't familiar with the realities of Arctic survival and the equipment necessary for safe travel through Alaska's interior during winter months. Morrison spent weeks processing the crime scene, working in conditions that challenged even his years of experience with Alaska's brutal climate. The ground was frozen solid to depths of several feet, making evidence recovery nearly impossible without specialized equipment that had to be transported hundreds of miles over dangerous roads. The remote location meant that every piece of equipment, every forensic specialist, every resource needed for the investigation had to be brought in over the Dalton Highway through weather conditions that regularly closed the road to all but essential traffic. The extreme cold created additional challenges for evidence preservation and analysis. Traditional forensic techniques had to be modified for conditions where standard procedures might destroy evidence or produce misleading results. Even the process of documenting the scene required specialized equipment designed to function in temperatures that would disable conventional cameras and recording devices within minutes of exposure to the Arctic air. But it was the discovery of the surveillance equipment that turned the investigation from a case of mass murder into something far more sinister and commercially motivated. Hidden cameras, positioned to record the entire death scene from multiple angles, suggested that the killings weren't just about eliminating witnesses or disposing of troublesome cargo. Someone had wanted to document the deaths for an audience willing to pay for the privilege of watching real people die under controlled conditions. The cameras were sophisticated, military-grade equipment designed to function in extreme weather conditions while transmitting high-quality video signals across vast distances to receivers that could be located hundreds of miles away. The installation had been professional, with concealed power sources and weatherproofing that would allow continuous operation throughout Alaska's harsh winter months. Someone had invested significant resources in creating a remote broadcasting capability that could document events for viewers who were never at risk themselves. The technical analysis of the camera system revealed satellite uplinks capable of broadcasting live video feeds to anywhere in the world, suggesting an international audience for whatever entertainment was being provided by the systematic murder of human beings in one of Earth's most hostile environments. The sophistication of the equipment and its installation indicated planning that had taken months or years and resources that exceeded anything typically associated with conventional criminal enterprises. The cameras led investigators to Earl Patterson, a 52-year-old former pipeline worker who had been operating what he called extreme tourism expeditions for wealthy clients who wanted to experience real danger in controlled environments that provided excitement without actual risk to paying customers. His operation combined human trafficking with a twisted form of entertainment that catered to individuals willing to pay enormous sums to watch real people die in manufactured survival situations designed to maximize suffering while ensuring optimal viewing angles for remote audiences. Patterson's background revealed a man whose legitimate work experience in Alaska's oil industry had provided him with detailed knowledge of remote locations, extreme weather survival techniques, and the logistics required for operations in areas where conventional support systems were unavailable. His years working on the North Slope had taught him how to survive and operate in conditions that would kill most people within hours, while his pipeline connections had provided access to equipment, transportation, and communication systems that made his criminal enterprise technically feasible. But Patterson hadn't just used his Alaska experience for criminal purposes. He had transformed it into a form of entertainment that combined sadistic psychology with sophisticated technology to create viewing experiences for clients whose appetites for violence exceeded anything that could be satisfied through conventional entertainment media. His customers weren't just paying for transportation across international borders. They were paying to watch other human beings die under controlled conditions that allowed them to experience the thrill of witnessing death without risking their own safety or legal consequences. The investigation revealed that Patterson had been operating his death tourism business for over 3 years, using the remote Dalton Highway as his killing ground while building an international client base of wealthy individuals who paid up to $50,000 each to watch live streams of people dying in extreme conditions. His clients included business executives from major corporations, foreign nationals from countries where human life was valued differently than in Western societies, and even some individuals with law enforcement and military backgrounds who found conventional forms of entertainment insufficient to satisfy their psychological needs for witnessing violence and death. Patterson's base of operations was discovered in an abandoned pipeline construction camp that he had converted into a comfortable facility equipped with satellite internet, professional video equipment, and living quarters that allowed him to monitor multiple camera feeds while maintaining communication with clients who were watching the deaths unfold in real time from the safety and comfort of their homes or offices thousands of miles away from the Arctic killing ground. The facility revealed the full scope of Patterson's operation and his sophisticated understanding of his clients' psychological needs and viewing preferences. Multiple monitoring stations allowed him to control camera angles and provide commentary during the death scenes, while communication equipment enabled real-time interaction with clients who could request specific forms of torture or particular camera perspectives during the killing process. He had essentially created a remote television studio designed to broadcast live murder for the entertainment of paying customers who viewed human death as a form of consumable media. The 17 victims found at mile marker 127 represented just one of Patterson's operations. Evidence discovered at his camp suggested that he had been conducting similar murders at various locations along the Dalton Highway and other remote areas throughout Alaska for years, always careful to choose locations where bodies might not be discovered for months or years, and where the extreme conditions would help preserve evidence of his sophistication while making investigation difficult for law enforcement agencies unprepared for the scale and technical complexity of his enterprise. Computer records found at Patterson's facility revealed the international scope of his client base and the shocking amounts of money involved in the death tourism industry that he had created. Payment records showed transactions totaling over $2 million from clients in North America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, with individual viewing sessions priced according to the number of victims, the methods of killing, and the duration of suffering that clients could witness during their paid viewing experiences. The client communications revealed appetites for violence that exceeded anything in FBI behavioral analysis, files dealing with serial killers and organized crime, requests for specific forms of torture, preferences for victim demographics, and detailed discussions of killing methods suggested a subculture of wealthy individuals whose psychological needs could only be satisfied through witnessing real death under conditions that eliminated any risk to themselves while maximizing their control over the suffering they were purchasing as entertainment. When Alaska State Troopers moved to arrest Patterson, they found that he had vanished from his compound, leaving behind only the evidence of his crimes and a note thanking his clients for their patronage while promising that his death tourism operations would continue under new management. Security footage showed him departing in a snowmobile loaded with survival supplies, heading north toward the Arctic Ocean along routes that would be virtually impossible to track across hundreds of square miles of frozen wilderness where experienced outdoorsmen could disappear permanently if they understood how to exploit the terrain and weather conditions. The manhunt for Earl Patterson became the largest search operation in Alaska State Trooper history, involving aircraft equipped with thermal imaging systems, snowmobile teams trained in wilderness tracking, and federal agents experienced in pursuing fugitives across international borders. But Patterson had advantages that made conventional pursuit techniques nearly useless. Years of experience working in Alaska's most remote regions, detailed knowledge of survival techniques and supply cache locations, and a network of clients and associates who might provide assistance in exchange for continued access to his death tourism services. Patterson's years working on the pipeline had taught him every route, every shelter, every cache of emergency supplies that existed across Alaska's North Slope, giving him intimate knowledge of territory that spanned thousands of square miles and included countless hiding places where someone with appropriate skills could survive indefinitely. He had also established supply caches and communication relay points that would allow him to maintain operations while remaining mobile across vast distances that would challenge even Alaska's most experienced wilderness trackers. The search continued for months, hampered by weather conditions that grounded aircraft for weeks at a time and terrain that challenged even Alaska's most experienced wilderness specialists. Patterson's trail led north toward Prudhoe Bay, then seemed to disappear entirely in the vastness of the Arctic Ocean ice pack, where tracking became impossible due to shifting ice conditions and weather that could kill searchers as easily as their target. Some investigators believed Patterson had died in the Arctic conditions, succumbing to the same elements he had used to kill his victims. Others thought he had escaped across the ice to Canada or Russia using smuggling routes he had learned during his years in the human trafficking business. But periodic signals from his satellite communication equipment suggested that he was still alive somewhere in the Arctic wilderness, possibly continuing his death tourism operations for clients who remained willing to pay premium prices for the ultimate extreme entertainment experience. The signals came from different locations across the North Slope, indicating movement and suggesting that Patterson had established a network of caches and shelters that allowed him to remain mobile across vast distances while maintaining the communication capabilities necessary for coordinating with clients and associates. The mobility made him nearly impossible to locate using conventional search techniques, while his technical sophistication allowed him to monitor law enforcement communications and avoid areas where search operations were active. 2 years after the discovery at mile marker 127, bodies continue to appear at remote locations throughout Alaska, discovered by hunters, tourists, or pipeline workers who stumble upon death scenes that display the same characteristics Patterson had used in his documented operations. The victims are always foreign nationals whose identification has been destroyed, always arranged in patterns that suggest ritualistic or entertainment purposes, and always discovered with evidence of prolonged torture and systematic abuse before their final execution and display. The pattern suggests that Patterson's death tourism operation continues, either under his direct control from his mobile base in the Arctic wilderness, or being operated by others who learned his methods and inherited his client base after his disappearance from the abandoned pipeline camp. Federal agencies continue to monitor communications and investigate financial transactions that might indicate the continued operation of death tourism services, but the international nature of the client base and the sophisticated money laundering techniques used to process payments make detection extremely difficult. Trooper Morrison still patrols the Dalton Highway, driving past mile marker 127 where 17 people died for the entertainment of wealthy clients who paid to watch real human beings suffer and die in one of Earth's most hostile environments. The memorial erected at the site includes the names of the identified victims, but 3 bodies remain unidentified, their families somewhere in the world still wondering what happened to their loved ones who disappeared trying to reach what they hoped would be a better life in America or Canada. The investigation files remain open, with federal agencies continuing to monitor satellite communications and investigate reports of similar operations in other remote areas where extreme conditions provide natural cover for activities that challenge fundamental assumptions about the boundaries of human cruelty and commercial exploitation. The vastness of Alaska's wilderness provides infinite hiding places for someone who understands how to survive in extreme conditions and has the resources to maintain operations across hundreds of square miles of territory that law enforcement can barely monitor, let alone control effectively. On clear nights, when the aurora borealis lights up the sky over the Dalton Highway in displays of natural beauty that seem to mock human suffering, Morrison sometimes wonders if Patterson is out there somewhere, watching the same cosmic light show while planning his next operation for clients who pay enormous sums for the privilege of watching real people die in Alaska's beautiful, merciless wilderness. The thought keeps him vigilant during his patrols, but it also reminds him that there are forms of evil in the world that exceed normal human understanding and challenge every assumption about the limits of criminal behavior. The death tourism industry that Patterson created continues to operate somewhere in Alaska's vast wilderness, serving clients whose appetites for witnessing real human death can only be satisfied through the systematic murder of vulnerable people who trusted criminals with their lives and dreams of a better future. The investigation continues, but Patterson remains free, possibly still operating his death tourism business from mobile bases scattered across Alaska's Arctic wilderness, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement, while providing ultimate entertainment for clients willing to pay any price to witness the real thing. The radio crackled to life at 4:17 a.m. as Alaska State Trooper Walter Grimm was finishing his patrol of the Kenai Peninsula, where the salmon runs brought both legitimate sportsmen and those who operated well outside the boundaries of law and conscience, in pursuit of trophies that had nothing to do with traditional hunting ethics or respect for Alaska's magnificent wildlife. The call came from a hunting guide named Roy, his voice tight with something that might have been fear or disgust. Grimm couldn't tell which through the static that plagued communications in the remote wilderness areas where cellular towers were as rare as honest politicians and twice as valuable to those who needed help in country that could kill the unprepared in dozens of different ways. Trooper dispatch, I need an officer at Skillack Lake, off the Sterling Highway. GPS coordinates follow. I've found something that ain't right. Something that ain't right at all, and I've been guiding hunters in this country for 20 years without seeing anything that comes close to what I found this morning. Grim had been working Alaska's vast hunting territories for 15 years, long enough to know that guides who spent their lives in the wilderness weren't easily rattled by the realities of death, predation, and the sometimes brutal facts of nature that governed life in Alaska's backcountry. Roy Hutchinson had been operating hunting expeditions on the Kenai for over 2 decades, guiding hunters after moose, caribou, brown bear, and mountain goats through country that could challenge even the most experienced outdoorsmen with weather that changed from beautiful to deadly within minutes, terrain that could hide bears or break ankles with equal efficiency, and distances that meant help might be days away, even if radio communications could penetrate the mountains and forests that defined the peninsula's rugged geography. Roy had guided corporate executives seeking trophy animals to hang in boardrooms, celebrities looking for authentic outdoor experiences away from paparazzi and publicists, foreign hunters willing to pay premium prices for opportunities to harvest species unavailable in their home countries, and working-class hunters who saved for years to afford guided expeditions that would give them stories to tell for the rest of their lives. He had seen accidental deaths, equipment failures, and the occasional case of buck fever that led to poor decision-making and dangerous situations, but he had never encountered anything that shattered his professional composure and left him unable to speak coherently about what he had discovered in Alaska's wilderness. If Roy Hutchinson was shaken by something he found in the forests where he had spent most of his adult life, there was excellent reason for law enforcement concern and immediate response, regardless of the challenges involved in reaching remote locations during Alaska's brief autumn season, when weather could transition from clear skies to blizzard conditions without warning. The drive to Skillack Lake took Grim through forests of spruce and birch that seemed to stretch endlessly toward mountains whose peaks disappeared into low clouds that promised snow before evening, and reminded him that winter was approaching with the relentless inevitability that characterized Alaska's seasonal transitions. The Sterling Highway was one of Alaska's most scenic routes during tourist season, carrying thousands of visitors seeking fishing, hunting, and wilderness experiences in one of North America's most spectacular natural settings. But it was also one of Alaska's most dangerous roads for those who didn't respect the rules or understand the difference between recreation and recklessness in country that demanded respect from everyone who entered its domain. The highway passed through territory that epitomized both the beauty and the dangers of Alaska's wilderness. Dense forests that could conceal brown bears weighing over 1,000 pounds, rivers that ran cold and fast enough to kill within minutes, and weather systems that could trap the unprepared in conditions that ranged from hypothermia-inducing rain to blizzards that made travel impossible and survival questionable for those without proper equipment and wilderness experience. It was country that attracted both legitimate outdoor enthusiasts and those whose appetites exceeded the boundaries of legal hunting and ethical conduct. What Roy had found would haunt Grim for the rest of his career in law enforcement and challenge his understanding of the relationship between human psychology and the wilderness that defined Alaska's identity and attracted people seeking experiences unavailable in the urbanized landscapes that characterized most of modern America. A clearing deep in the forest, maybe 3 acres in size, where someone had been conducting a hunting operation that violated every law, every ethical standard, every basic principle of human decency that governed the relationship between man and nature in civilized society. The clearing was littered with carcasses, dozens of them, but these weren't the clean kills of a legitimate hunting operation conducted by sportsmen who respected both the law and the animals they pursued for sustenance, trophy recognition, or the authentic outdoor experiences that had drawn humans into Alaska's wilderness for thousands of years. Moose, caribou, Doll sheep, mountain goats, brown bears, black bears. Alaska's most magnificent wildlife had been slaughtered and left to rot in arrangements that suggested systematic torture rather than hunting for any traditional purpose. The carcasses showed evidence of prolonged suffering that served no practical or sporting purpose, wounds that had been inflicted to cause pain rather than clean kills, and methods of death that represented a perversion of everything that hunting was supposed to represent in Alaska's outdoor culture. But it wasn't the waste that made Roy's hands shake as he led Grim through the carnage that had transformed a beautiful wilderness clearing into a monument to systematic cruelty. It was the way the animals had been killed, the evidence of deliberate torture that extended far beyond anything that could be explained by poor marksmanship, equipment failure, or the kind of accidents that occasionally occurred during legitimate hunting operations conducted by inexperienced or overconfident hunters. Each carcass showed signs of systematic torture that had been inflicted over extended periods of time before the animals were finally killed. Animals that had been wounded repeatedly but not killed, allowed to suffer for hours or days before finally being put down in ways that maximized pain, rather than providing the quick, clean death that ethical hunters considered essential to responsible wildlife harvesting. Antlers and horns that had been removed while the animals were still alive, creating wounds that would have caused excruciating pain while serving no purpose beyond satisfying someone's sadistic impulses. Evidence of burns, cuts, and other deliberate infliction of pain that served no purpose beyond the sadistic pleasure of whoever had created this monument to cruelty in one of Alaska's most beautiful wilderness areas. The torture had been systematic, methodical, and prolonged, suggesting not opportunistic cruelty but planned activities designed to maximize animal suffering while providing entertainment or gratification for individuals whose psychology had been twisted into something monstrous. The arrangement of the carcasses suggested that the torture had been conducted as a form of entertainment, with optimal viewing angles and evidence of seating arrangements that would have allowed observers to watch the systematic infliction of pain and death on Alaska's most magnificent wildlife species. Someone had been using animal torture as a form of recreational activity, turning Alaska's wilderness into a theater for cruelty that exceeded anything in Grim's experience with criminal behavior. "I've been guiding hunters for 20 years, Roy told Grim as they documented the scene with photographs that would later be used as evidence in what became one of Alaska's most disturbing wildlife crime investigations. "I've seen poachers who kill for profit. I've seen accidents where inexperience led to poor shots and wounded animals. I've seen stupidity and recklessness that resulted in unnecessary animal suffering. But I never seen anything like this. This ain't hunting. This is something else entirely. Something that makes me question what some people are capable of doing when they think nobody's watching." The investigation that followed would reveal a hunting operation that catered to clients whose interests went far beyond traditional trophy hunting or even illegal poaching for profit. The operation had been designed to provide experiences that couldn't be obtained through any legitimate outdoor recreation activities, serving individuals whose psychological needs exceeded anything that could be satisfied through conventional hunting, fishing, or wildlife viewing opportunities available through Alaska's legal outfitting industry. Evidence found throughout the clearing indicated that the torture operation had been professionally organized, with sophisticated equipment for restraining animals while prolonging their suffering, medical supplies that would allow operators to keep wounded animals alive for extended periods, while clients experimented with different methods of inflicting pain, and even psychological evaluation forms that helped match clients with animals and torture methods that would provide maximum satisfaction for their specific psychological appetites and preferences. Dr. Richard Kellerman, a retired surgeon from Anchorage, had been operating what he called enhanced hunting experiences for wealthy individuals who found conventional hunting insufficiently challenging or stimulating for their psychological needs. His operation combined illegal hunting of protected species with elements of systematic animal torture designed to provide clients with what he described as authentic predator experiences that allowed participants to explore aspects of human nature that civilized society normally suppressed through legal restrictions and ethical standards that limited expressions of violence and dominance. Kellerman's background revealed a man whose legitimate medical training had been perverted into expertise in prolonging suffering and preventing death, until maximum pain had been inflicted on victims who could not escape or resist the systematic torture being conducted for the entertainment of paying customers. His surgical knowledge of anatomy allowed him to wound animals in ways that caused excruciating pain without immediately causing death, extending the entertainment value for clients who were paying enormous sums for experiences unavailable through any legal recreational activities. The clients weren't poachers in any traditional sense of individuals seeking profit from illegal wildlife harvesting. They were wealthy professionals, doctors, lawyers, business executives, foreign nationals, who had become bored with conventional forms of recreation and were seeking increasingly extreme experiences that would provide the psychological stimulation they craved but couldn't obtain through legal entertainment options or conventional outdoor activities available through Alaska's legitimate outfitting industry. Kellerman had identified a market among individuals whose success in legitimate careers hadn't satisfied their psychological need for power and control over life and death, particularly the kind of absolute control that could only be exercised over helpless victims who could not escape, resist, or retaliate against their tormentors. His clients were seeking experiences that allowed them to explore psychological territories that were forbidden by law and social convention in their normal lives. Evidence recovered from Kellerman's base camp revealed the sophisticated nature of his operation and the systematic approach he had developed for providing extreme recreational experiences to clients whose appetites for violence and suffering exceeded anything that could be satisfied through conventional entertainment media or legal recreational activities. Professional video equipment documented the torture sessions for clients who wanted permanent records of their experiences, allowing them to relive the suffering they had inflicted while planning future sessions that would provide even more intense gratification. Medical supplies and equipment allowed Kellerman to keep wounded animals alive for extended periods, while clients experimented with different methods of inflicting pain, using his surgical knowledge to prevent death until customers had extracted maximum enjoyment from their victim's agony. The medical approach to torture represented a particularly sophisticated form of cruelty that combined professional knowledge with sadistic psychology to create experiences that exceeded anything available through conventional criminal activities. Even psychological evaluation forms that helped Kellerman match clients with animals, and torture methods that would provide maximum satisfaction based on their individual psychological profiles and preferences. The evaluations revealed a systematic approach to cruelty that treated animal torture as a form of customized entertainment that could be optimized for each client's specific psychological needs and appetites for witnessing and inflicting suffering. The operation had been running for over 5 years, with Kellerman using his medical background to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of animal torture that provided maximum suffering while keeping victims alive as long as possible to extend the entertainment value for clients who were paying up to $20,000 for weekend torture experiences that couldn't be obtained through any legal recreational activities. His surgeon's knowledge of anatomy and physiology had been applied to developing torture techniques that maximized pain while preventing death, allowing clients to experiment with different methods of inflicting suffering while learning about their own psychological responses to witnessing and causing pain. The medical approach to torture represented a particularly disturbing form of recreational cruelty that combined professional expertise with sadistic entertainment in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the ethics of medical training and professional responsibility. Kellerman's clients included individuals from across the United States and several foreign countries, all of whom had been attracted to his operation through word-of-mouth recommendations and encrypted communications that promised experiences unavailable through any legitimate outfitters or conventional recreational activities. The client list revealed a network of individuals who regularly communicated about their torture experiences and shared techniques for maximizing animal suffering while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies that might not understand the psychological value of extreme recreational activities. The correspondence between Kellerman and his clients revealed appetites for violence and suffering that exceeded anything in FBI behavioral analysis files dealing with serial killers and violent criminals. Detailed discussions of torture techniques, preferences for specific animal species, and requests for increasingly sophisticated methods of inflicting pain suggested a subculture of wealthy individuals whose psychological needs could only be satisfied through witnessing and participating in real animal torture under controlled conditions that eliminated legal risk while maximizing entertainment value. When Alaska state troopers moved to arrest Kellerman at his remote cabin near Soldotna, they discovered that he had been expanding his operation beyond wildlife into territory that challenged every assumption about the boundaries of human cruelty and criminal behavior. The cabin contained evidence that he had been considering offering ultimate hunting experiences that would involve human targets, with preliminary communications to clients about the availability of the most dangerous game for those whose appetites had been stimulated by animal torture to the point where only human victims would provide adequate psychological satisfaction. The correspondence revealed that Kellerman had been in contact with human trafficking networks about acquiring volunteers for hunting experiences that would provide clients with opportunities to hunt human prey in controlled conditions that would ensure the safety of the hunters while guaranteeing the death of their targets. Several clients had expressed interest in this ultimate form of hunting, with some offering to pay up to $100,000 for the experience of stalking and killing human beings in Alaska's wilderness. The communications revealed detailed discussions of hunting techniques, weapon preferences, and methods for ensuring that human prey would provide optimal challenges for hunters while guaranteeing satisfactory outcomes for paying customers. The progression from animal torture to planned human hunting represented an escalation that challenged every assumption about criminal behavior and the boundaries of recreational violence that wealthy individuals might pursue in search of ultimate entertainment experiences. Kellerman was arrested without incident, but the investigation revealed that his torture hunting operation was part of a larger network of individuals who provided extreme recreational experiences for wealthy clients seeking thrills unavailable through legal means. The network included operations in several other states and foreign countries, all catering to individuals whose appetites for violence and suffering had escalated beyond what conventional entertainment could satisfy through legal recreational activities or commercial media products. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that Kellerman viewed both animals and humans as objects whose value was determined solely by their ability to provide entertainment through their suffering, and whose existence was justified only by their utility in serving the psychological needs of individuals wealthy enough to pay for extreme recreational experiences that challenged conventional ethical boundaries and legal restrictions on violent behavior. His medical training had been perverted into an expertise in prolonging pain and preventing death until his clients had extracted maximum enjoyment from their victims' agony, treating both animal and human suffering as raw materials for providing customized entertainment experiences that could not be obtained through any legal recreational activities or conventional commercial entertainment products available to wealthy consumers seeking increasingly extreme gratification. During interrogation, Kellerman showed no remorse for his crimes, instead expressing pride in his ability to provide clients with authentic experiences that allowed them to explore aspects of their nature that society normally repressed through legal restrictions and ethical standards that limited expressions of violence and dominance over helpless victims. He maintained that his operation served an important psychological function, by providing safe outlets for violent impulses that might otherwise be directed toward human targets in uncontrolled situations. People need to understand their true nature, Kellerman told investigators with the clinical detachment that characterized his entire worldview and approach to providing recreational torture services. Civilization has made us weak, made us deny the predator instincts that are fundamental to human psychology and essential to understanding our species' relationship with power, dominance, and control over weaker beings. My clients discovered who they really are when they stopped pretending to be something they're not. The animals were just tools for teaching them about themselves and their capacity for exercising absolute power over helpless victims. The trial became a landmark case in Alaska wildlife law, as prosecutors had to prove that systematic animal torture constituted more than simple poaching or illegal hunting violations. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological damage caused by deliberate cruelty and the connection between animal torture and human violence that made Kellerman's operation a threat to public safety as well as wildlife conservation, representing a form of criminal behavior that challenged conventional approaches to law enforcement and criminal prosecution. Kellerman was ultimately convicted on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy, animal cruelty, illegal hunting, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise that provided services to clients whose psychological needs exceeded anything that could be satisfied through legal recreational activities. His conviction resulted in a 25-year sentence and the largest financial penalty ever imposed for wildlife crimes in Alaska. But the investigation revealed connections to similar operations in other states that suggested the problem extended far beyond Kellerman's individual crimes. Federal agencies launched a nationwide investigation into extreme hunting operations that discovered a network of individuals providing torture-based recreation to wealthy clients across the country, revealing the existence of a previously unknown industry that catered to individuals whose psychological needs couldn't be satisfied through legal forms of entertainment or recreational activities available through conventional commercial providers or legitimate outdoor outfitting operations. The investigation revealed that Kellerman's operation was part of a growing industry that specialized in providing extreme recreational experiences to wealthy clients whose appetites for violence and suffering had been stimulated by conventional entertainment media to the point where only real torture and death could provide adequate psychological satisfaction and entertainment value that justified the enormous sums they were willing to pay for authentic experiences unavailable through legal means. For Trooper Grimm, who had devoted his career to protecting Alaska's wildlife and ensuring that hunting remained a legitimate sport based on respect for nature and fair chase principles that honored both the animals and the wilderness that sustained them, the Kellerman case represented a fundamental challenge to everything he believed about the relationship between humans and the natural world that defined Alaska's identity and attracted millions of visitors seeking authentic outdoor experiences. He took everything good about hunting and turned it into something evil, Grimm explained during a training session for wildlife officers from across Alaska, who needed to understand how legitimate outdoor recreation could be perverted into criminal enterprises that threatened both wildlife populations and public safety. Kellerman understood that some people have appetites that can't be satisfied through normal means, and he built a business around feeding those appetites, using Alaska's wildlife as raw material for providing entertainment that challenged every ethical standard and legal boundary that governs human behavior in civilized society. The site where Kellerman operated his torture camp was eventually cleared and restored through environmental remediation efforts that removed all traces of the equipment and facilities used for systematic animal torture. But the area remains closed to hunting as a memorial to the animals that died there, and a reminder of the potential for human psychology to be twisted into forms of cruelty that exceed normal understanding of criminal behavior and recreational violence. The investigation led to enhanced monitoring of hunting guides and outfitters across Alaska, with new requirements for reporting unusual client requests or activities that might indicate illegal operations or the kind of extreme recreational services that wealthy individuals might seek in remote areas where conventional law enforcement oversight is limited by geographical challenges and resource constraints that characterize Alaska's vast wilderness regions. Today, legitimate hunting guides throughout Alaska are trained to recognize the signs of clients who might be interested in illegal or cruel activities that exceed the boundaries of conventional hunting ethics and legal outdoor recreation. Reporting systems have been established to alert law enforcement to potential torture operations before they can become established, while enhanced communication systems allow guides to contact authorities immediately when they encounter evidence of systematic animal cruelty or other criminal activities in remote wilderness areas. The Kellerman case serves as a reminder that the vast wilderness that makes Alaska a paradise for legitimate sportsmen and outdoor enthusiasts can also provide cover for those who exploit that wilderness for purposes that violate every principle of ethical hunting and wildlife conservation. The isolation and beauty that attract millions of visitors to Alaska's outdoor recreation opportunities also create conditions where criminal enterprises can operate without detection for extended periods while providing services to clients whose psychological needs exceed anything that can be satisfied through legal recreational activities. Alaska State Trooper Donald Frank received the call at 11:43 p.m. on an August night when the air hung heavy with smoke from wildfires burning across 3 different mountain ranges, and the orange glow on the horizon made it impossible to tell whether the sun was setting late or the forest was burning early in what had become the most destructive fire season in Alaska's recorded history. The logging community of Healy Fork, population 847, was being evacuated for the 3rd time that summer as another fire approached the town with the kind of methodical inevitability that made experienced wildland firefighters speak in hushed tones about patterns they didn't want to acknowledge out loud. The smell of smoke had become so constant that residents no longer noticed it, breathing air thick with particles that turned sunsets into apocalyptic displays of red and orange that photographers would have found beautiful if they hadn't understood that each spectacular sunset represented thousands of acres of forest reduced to ash and the displacement of entire communities whose existence depended on the timber industry that sustained Alaska's remote logging towns through long winters when other forms of employment virtually disappeared. Trooper Frank, this is Fire Marshal Davidson calling from Incident Command. We need you at the Incident Command post immediately. We've got a situation that requires law enforcement presence, and it can't wait until morning. I'm not comfortable discussing details over radio, but this involves patterns we've been tracking all summer, and tonight we found evidence that changes everything we thought we knew about these fires. Frank had been working Alaska's logging territories for 8 years, long enough to know that fire season brought out both the best and worst in people who lived in communities where survival depended on forest resources, and where fire represented both natural renewal and economic catastrophe. The heroism of firefighters who risked their lives to protect communities and wilderness areas that might never recover from severe burns. The generosity of volunteers who opened their homes to evacuees and donated supplies to relief efforts. But also the opportunism of thieves who looted abandoned homes during evacuations. The insurance fraud attempts of people who saw disaster as a business opportunity, and sometimes the twisted psychology of individuals who found sexual or emotional satisfaction in watching things burn. Frank understood that fire in Alaska's forests was both natural and necessary for ecosystem health, clearing undergrowth and creating conditions for new growth while maintaining the complex relationships between plant and animal species that had evolved with periodic burning over thousands of years. But the fires burning across Alaska's interior this summer were different, too frequent, too intense, too strategically located to be entirely natural phenomena governed by lightning strikes, drought conditions, or the normal cycles that regulated forest ecosystems. The drive to Healy Fork took Frank through landscapes that looked like scenes from the apocalypse, transformed by fires that had burned with unusual intensity and left behind devastation that exceeded anything in his experience with Alaska's natural fire cycles. Entire hillsides reduced to blackened sticks that stood like monuments to destruction against skies that glowed with reflected flames from distant fires still burning out of control. Creek beds filled with ash instead of water, their flow interrupted by debris from burned forests that had collapsed into waterways and created temporary dams that would cause flooding problems when the rains returned. Wildlife fleeing ahead of the flames created hazards for drivers as animals sought escape routes that brought them into conflict with human transportation systems. But their behavior patterns suggested that the fires were moving faster and more unpredictably than natural wildfire behavior would normally allow. Moose, caribou, and smaller animals were displaying panic responses that exceeded their normal reaction to wildfire, suggesting that they were encountering fire behavior that violated their evolutionary adaptations for surviving in ecosystems where periodic burning was a natural part of their environment. Fire Marshal Davidson met Frank at the command post with satellite photos and incident reports that painted a disturbing picture of the fire behavior that had been terrorizing Alaska's logging communities throughout the summer, revealing patterns that challenged every assumption about wildfire causation and behavior in Alaska's forest ecosystems. 7 major fires in remote areas, all starting under suspicious circumstances, all displaying burn patterns that suggested human causation rather than natural ignition from lightning strikes or equipment failures that typically caused wildfires in Alaska's logging territories. These aren't natural fires, Davidson explained as he spread the aerial photographs across a folding table inside the incident command trailer, while Frank studied images that revealed burn patterns unlike anything in his experience with Alaska's wildfire investigations. The ignition points are too precise, the spread patterns too consistent with accelerant use, and the timing too coordinated to be coincidental. Someone's been setting these fires deliberately, and they understand enough about wildfire behavior to create maximum damage while avoiding detection by our standard investigation procedures. The fires had consumed over 200,000 acres of forest and threatened 6 different logging communities, forcing evacuations that displaced thousands of people and cost the state millions of dollars in firefighting resources while devastating the timber industry that provided economic stability for Alaska's remote logging communities during times when other forms of employment were unavailable or insufficient to sustain families through long winters when outdoor work became impossible or extremely dangerous. But the pattern wasn't random destruction designed to cause maximum economic damage or environmental harm. Someone was targeting specific areas with sophisticated knowledge of wind patterns, fuel loads, and terrain features that would allow fires to spread with maximum efficiency toward populated areas, while making suppression efforts more difficult and dangerous for firefighters, whose safety depended on predictable fire behavior and established suppression techniques. Each fire had started in remote locations where detection would be delayed by hours or days, giving flames time to establish themselves in forest ecosystems before firefighting resources could respond effectively to initial suppression efforts. The ignition points were chosen to take advantage of natural fire breaks and wind patterns that would direct the fires toward valuable timber stands and populated areas, while making suppression efforts more complicated and resource-intensive than would be necessary for fires starting in more accessible locations. The investigation revealed evidence of a coordinated arson campaign that combined detailed knowledge of forestry and fire behavior with sophisticated planning and execution that suggested military or law enforcement training in tactical operations and strategic thinking. Accelerant residue found at ignition points indicated the use of materials specifically designed to create intense, fast-moving fires that would be difficult to control once established in forest ecosystems that had been dried by unusually hot summer weather and reduced precipitation. But the most disturbing discovery was the surveillance equipment found at several fire scenes. Hidden cameras positioned to record the fires as they developed from initial ignition through major conflagration, suggesting that the arsonist wasn't just setting fires for the destruction they caused, but was documenting their progress for purposes that might involve personal gratification, commercial exploitation, or as evidence of tactical effectiveness for training purposes or demonstration to potential clients interested in similar services. The cameras were sophisticated, military-grade equipment designed to function in extreme heat and weather conditions, while transmitting high-quality video feeds to remote locations where the footage could be monitored, recorded, and analyzed by individuals who were never at risk from the fires they were watching develop. The installation had been professional, with concealed power sources and weatherproofing that would allow continuous operation throughout Alaska's fire season despite exposure to extreme temperatures, smoke, and the chaotic conditions created by major wildfire events. The cameras led investigators to Eugene Patterson, a 46-year-old former forestry technician who had been terminated from the Alaska Division of Forestry 3 years earlier, following complaints about his obsession with wildfire behavior and his inappropriate responses to fire emergency situations that had concerned supervisors and colleagues who worked with him during suppression operations. Patterson's personnel file revealed a pattern of behavior that had alarmed his employers long before his dismissal from state employment. Patterson had shown unusual excitement during fire suppression operations, often volunteering for the most dangerous assignments and displaying what supervisors described as unhealthy fascination with the destructive power of wildfire that went beyond professional interest in fire behavior and suppression techniques. He had been disciplined multiple times for taking unnecessary risks during suppression operations, for making comments about the beauty of destruction that made his colleagues uncomfortable, and for behaviors that suggested he derived psychological or emotional satisfaction from witnessing forest fires and the destruction they caused to both natural ecosystems and human communities. His termination had resulted from an incident during a major fire suppression operation where Patterson had been observed taking photographs and video recordings of burning forests while neglecting his assigned duties in suppression efforts, leading to safety concerns and questions about his priorities during emergency operations that required absolute focus on protecting lives and property. Supervisors had also noted his tendency to linger at fire scenes after suppression operations were complete, sometimes returning to burned areas on his own time to examine fire damage and take additional photographs that served no apparent professional purpose. When Alaska State Troopers executed a search warrant at Patterson's remote cabin near Fairbanks, they discovered evidence of an obsession with fire that had evolved from professional interest into something far more dangerous and personally motivated than could be explained by legitimate research interests or career development in wildfire management and forestry practices. The cabin was filled with detailed maps of Alaska's forests, marked with optimal fire locations, weather data, and fuel load assessments that would allow precise timing of arson operations, and video equipment for recording and analyzing fire behavior from initial ignition through complete forest destruction. The maps revealed a systematic approach to arson that combined detailed knowledge of forest ecosystems with strategic planning that took into account seasonal weather patterns, firefighting resources and response capabilities, and the economic impact that major fires would have on logging communities dependent on forest resources for their survival. Patterson had been conducting reconnaissance of potential fire sites for years, documenting fuel loads, access routes, prevailing wind patterns, and proximity to valuable timber stands or populated areas that would maximize the impact of arson operations. But the most chilling discovery was Patterson's collection of recordings from his arson operations, hours of high-definition video showing fires developing from initial ignition through major conflagration, with audio commentary that revealed a man who derived intense sexual and emotional satisfaction from watching forests burn and communities flee in terror from fires that he had deliberately created for his own psychological gratification and entertainment. "The fire is alive," Patterson could be heard saying in one recording as he watched flames consume a hillside above Healy Fork, while families evacuated their homes and firefighters risked their lives to protect structures and natural resources threatened by his arson. It moves like a predator. It hunts. It feeds. It grows stronger with each tree it consumes. These people have no idea what they're facing when they try to fight something that's more intelligent and more determined than they are. Fire always wins in the end because it understands its purpose, while humans just react to what they don't understand. The recordings revealed that Patterson had been documenting his arson operations not just for personal gratification, but as part of a larger project to demonstrate what he called the futility of human attempts to control natural forces that were meant to dominate the landscape. His fires were designed to overwhelm suppression efforts and prove that human communities were ultimately helpless against the destructive power of nature, properly unleashed by individuals who understood how to work with natural forces rather than against them. Patterson's psychological framework viewed civilization as an artificial construct that interfered with natural processes of destruction and renewal that fire represented in forest ecosystems, and he saw his arson operations as a form of environmental activism that restored natural balance by eliminating human interference with ecological processes that had governed forest ecosystems for thousands of years before human settlement and fire suppression policies had disrupted natural cycles of burning and regrowth. Patterson's background revealed a man whose legitimate expertise in forest management had been twisted into something monstrous by a combination of personal grievances against the Forestry Service that had employed and then dismissed him, and psychological dysfunction that expressed itself through increasingly dangerous acts of arson that endangered both natural ecosystems and human communities throughout Alaska's logging territories. His termination from the Forestry Service had been the catalyst that transformed professional frustration into criminal behavior that threatened entire communities and vast areas of Alaska's forests. Evidence found at his cabin showed that Patterson had been planning his arson campaign for over 2 years, studying weather patterns, fuel conditions, and suppression capabilities to identify opportunities where maximum damage could be inflicted with minimal risk of detection by law enforcement or firefighting personnel. His fires were timed to coincide with periods when firefighting resources were already strained by natural fires or other emergency operations, ensuring that his arson fires would have time to establish themselves and spread before adequate suppression efforts could be mounted by agencies already operating at capacity. The investigation also revealed that Patterson had been in contact with other individuals interested in wildfire arson, sharing techniques and coordinating activities across multiple states in what appeared to be a loose network of fire enthusiasts who provided each other with technical support and encouragement for increasingly sophisticated arson operations that challenged conventional fire suppression capabilities and threatened both wilderness areas and populated communities across the western United States. When law enforcement moved to arrest Patterson, they discovered that he had anticipated capture and had rigged his cabin with incendiary devices designed to destroy evidence while creating one final spectacular fire that would serve as his signature statement about the power of fire to cleanse the landscape of human interference with natural processes. The devices were connected to motion sensors and timers that would have created a massive explosion and fire if triggered by anyone entering the property without knowledge of their locations and disarmament procedures. Bomb disposal experts from the FBI spent 6 hours carefully disarming the devices, working in extreme heat and dangerous conditions, while Patterson barricaded himself in a fire tower he had constructed on his property and began broadcasting rambling manifestos about the need for humanity to accept its powerlessness against the forces of nature properly unleashed by individuals who understood fire's true potential for restoring natural balance to ecosystems corrupted by human civilization. The standoff ended when Patterson, apparently unwilling to be taken alive and facing the prospect of federal prosecution for domestic terrorism charges related to his systematic arson campaign, ignited himself using accelerants he had prepared for his final demonstration of fire's power to transform both landscape and human flesh. The fire tower became a massive torch that could be seen for miles, creating a spectacular finale to a man whose life had become consumed by his obsession with watching things burn, and whose death provided one last demonstration of fire's ability to consume everything in its path. The investigation of Patterson's network led to arrests of similar arsonists in several other states, revealing a subculture of individuals who derived psychological and sexual satisfaction from setting fires and watching the destruction they caused while justifying their activities through environmental ideology that portrayed human civilization as a corrupting force that needed to be cleansed through systematic burning of forests, structures, and ultimately human populations that interfered with natural processes. 3 years after Patterson's death, Alaska continues to experience suspicious wildfires that display characteristics similar to his operations, suggesting that the network he helped establish remains active, with new members stepping in to continue the arson campaigns he had initiated across Alaska's logging territories and other western states. The psychological profile developed from his case has helped investigators identify and arrest several other fire enthusiasts. But the vast wilderness of Alaska provides infinite opportunities for those who understand how to exploit fire behavior for criminal purposes while avoiding detection by agencies with limited resources and personnel. Trooper Frank now works closely with fire investigators throughout Alaska, helping to identify suspicious fire behavior and investigate potential arson operations before they can cause major destruction to forest ecosystems and human communities. His experience with the Patterson case has made him one of Alaska's leading experts on wildfire arson and the psychology of individuals who derive satisfaction from watching communities burn while justifying their activities through ideological frameworks that portray destruction as necessary for environmental or social renewal. Patterson understood that fire was the perfect weapon for someone seeking maximum destruction with minimal personal risk. Frank explained during a training session for law enforcement officers across Alaska who needed to understand the threat posed by arson networks operating in wilderness areas. It destroys evidence of its own creation, creates chaos that overwhelms emergency response capabilities, and can cause massive damage with minimal effort from the perpetrator. The scary part is how many people out there share his fascination with destruction and have the technical knowledge to turn that fascination into systematic campaigns that threaten entire regions. The logging communities that Patterson targeted have implemented enhanced fire prevention and detection systems, including networks of remote cameras and sensors that can detect fires in their earliest stages and alert suppression resources before arsonists can achieve the kind of established burns that made Patterson's fires so difficult to suppress. But the remote nature of Alaska's forests makes complete protection impossible, particularly during fire season when conditions are optimal for rapid fire spread and suppression resources are already strained by natural fires requiring immediate attention. On summer evenings, when smoke fills the air and the horizon glows with distant fires that may or may not be natural, Frank sometimes wonders how many other Eugene Pattersons are out there in Alaska's vast wilderness, planning their next operations and waiting for optimal conditions to unleash destruction on forests and communities that depend on those forests for their economic survival and cultural identity. The thought keeps him vigilant during fire season, but it also reminds him that the wilderness he has sworn to protect can also provide cover for those who would exploit that same wilderness for purposes that threaten everything he values about Alaska's natural heritage. Alaska State Trooper Charles Hawkins had seen plenty of robbery scenes during his 14 years patrolling the remote communities scattered across Alaska's interior like islands of human determination in an ocean of wilderness that could swallow entire cities without a trace. But nothing had prepared him for what he found at Morrison's trading post on the morning of September 15, 2022, when the October snow was already falling in thick, heavy flakes that turned the landscape into a monochrome painting of survival and isolation, where the aurora borealis had begun its nightly dance across skies that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of imagination and human endurance. The call came in from Ray Morrison himself, though his voice was so shattered by terror and disbelief that dispatch initially thought they were dealing with someone having a complete psychological breakdown, rather than reporting an actual crime that had transformed his life's work into a scene of systematic cruelty that challenged every assumption about criminal behavior in Alaska's remote communities, where violence was typically driven by desperation, addiction, or the kind of interpersonal conflicts that arose when people were forced to depend on each other for survival in conditions that tested human nature and revealed both its best and worst qualities. "They took everything," Morrison kept repeating in a voice that carried the hollow quality of someone whose understanding of reality had been fundamentally shattered by experiences that exceeded his ability to process or explain. "But that ain't the worst part. Jesus Christ, that ain't even close to the worst part. What they did to my customers, what they made me watch. I don't think I'll ever sleep again knowing what some people are capable of doing when they think nobody can stop them." Morrison's trading post served as the economic lifeline for an area larger than most eastern states, providing everything from hunting supplies and winter gear to basic groceries and life-saving medication for indigenous communities, seasonal workers, and the handful of permanent residents who chose to live in country where the nearest neighbor might be 50 miles away and the nearest hospital could be a day's journey, even in perfect conditions that rarely existed during Alaska's brutal winter months, when temperatures could drop to levels that killed exposed skin within minutes and where mechanical failures could mean death for anyone unprepared for the realities of survival in one of Earth's most hostile environments. The trading post was more than just a commercial establishment. It functioned as a community center, unofficial post office, and informal bank for people who lived beyond the reach of conventional services that residents of urban areas took for granted. Morrison had been operating the post for over 30 years, extending credit to hunters who needed supplies before their seasonal income arrived, storing mail and packages for communities without postal service, and providing emergency supplies to travelers who found themselves stranded by weather or mechanical problems that could quickly become life-threatening situations in Alaska's remote interior, where help might be hours or days away even under optimal conditions. Morrison understood that his trading post represented survival itself for many of his customers, and he had built relationships with indigenous communities, seasonal workers, and permanent residents that went far beyond simple commercial transactions to encompass the kind of mutual dependence and trust that characterized human survival in extreme environments where individual self-sufficiency was often insufficient for dealing with the challenges that Alaska's wilderness presented to those who chose to live beyond the protective boundaries of modern urban civilization. Hawkins arrived to find the trading post completely ransacked, but not in the random, chaotic manner typical of opportunistic robberies conducted by drug addicts, desperate individuals, or amateur criminals seeking quick cash and easily portable valuables. This had been systematic, methodical, almost surgical in its precision and thoroughness, suggesting perpetrators who understood exactly what they were looking for and had taken the time to search every inch of the building while leaving clear messages about what would happen to anyone who interfered with their operations or attempted to resist their control over the economic infrastructure that sustained Alaska's remote communities. The cash register had been emptied, but that represented just the beginning of a theft operation that targeted everything of value in Morrison's extensive inventory. The real value in Morrison's stock, hunting rifles and ammunition that provided both food and protection for subsistence hunters, cold weather survival gear that could mean the difference between life and death during Alaska's brutal winters, expensive optics and GPS equipment that allowed safe navigation through wilderness where landmarks were scarce and weather conditions could eliminate visibility, satellite phones that provided emergency communication capabilities when conventional systems failed, All of it was gone, removed with systematic efficiency that suggested military-style planning and execution. But the perpetrators had also taken items that made no obvious economic sense for conventional robbery operations. Personal photographs that documented Morrison's relationships with his customers and communities, detailed customer records that contained information about purchasing patterns and credit relationships, and carefully annotated maps of the region that Morrison had developed over decades of serving Alaska's remote communities, and that contained invaluable information about seasonal residents, hunting camps, remote cabins, and the logistics networks that connected isolated populations to the outside world. The theft of information and documentation suggested that the robbery was part of a larger operation designed to understand and potentially control the economic relationships that sustained Alaska's remote communities, rather than a simple criminal enterprise focused on acquiring valuable merchandise for resale through conventional criminal distribution networks. Someone was systematically gathering intelligence about the infrastructure and relationships that made survival possible in Alaska's remote regions. What made Hawkins's blood run cold wasn't what had been stolen, but what had been left behind as a warning to anyone who might consider interfering with future operations or resisting the new economic reality that the perpetrators intended to impose on Alaska's remote communities. Morrison's elderly customers, 3 of them, had been bound and gagged in the store's back room, forced to watch as their lifeline to the outside world was systematically destroyed and their personal safety was threatened in ways that would leave permanent psychological scars. The 3 victims hadn't been killed, but they had been marked with precise symbols that seemed to carry specific meaning for whoever had orchestrated the robbery and wanted to send clear messages about what would happen to community members who failed to cooperate with the new economic arrangements being imposed by outside criminal organizations. The symbols had been carved into exposed skin with surgical precision, designed to leave permanent scars that would serve as warnings visible to anyone who encountered the victims. Each victim bore different symbols, but all were shallow wounds that had been inflicted with medical precision to avoid causing life-threatening injuries, while ensuring that the scars would be permanent reminders of what had occurred at Morrison's trading post. The precision of the cutting suggested either medical training or experience with systematic torture techniques designed to inflict maximum psychological impact while minimizing the risk of accidental death that might trigger enhanced law enforcement attention. The symbols appeared to be part of a communication system that would allow other criminals to identify individuals who had been marked for cooperation or resistance, essentially turning the victims into walking advertisements for the criminal organization's power and willingness to use violence against anyone who interfered with their operations. The marking system represented a particularly sophisticated form of psychological terrorism that combined physical intimidation with symbolic communication designed to control entire communities through fear. "They made us watch," whispered Dorothy Fleming, a 73-year-old widow who had lived in the area since Alaska's statehood and had never encountered anything like the methodical cruelty that had been inflicted on Morrison's customers by perpetrators who understood how to use systematic violence for maximum psychological impact. They wanted us to see exactly what they could do, wanted us to remember every detail so we could tell other folks what happens to people who get in their way or try to resist the new arrangements they're putting in place. Dorothy's testimony revealed that the perpetrators had spent considerable time explaining their intentions and demonstrating their capabilities, treating the robbery not just as a theft operation, but as an educational experience designed to teach the local community about the new economic reality that was being imposed by criminal organizations that understood how to exploit Alaska's remote communities through systematic intimidation and control of essential services and supplies. The perpetrators had made it clear that Morrison's trading post was just the beginning of a campaign to gain control over the economic infrastructure that sustained Alaska's remote communities, and that anyone who attempted to interfere with their operations or maintain independent economic relationships would face consequences that exceeded anything in the victim's previous experience with crime or violence in Alaska's typically peaceful rural communities. The investigation revealed that Morrison's trading post had been targeted not for a simple robbery operation designed to acquire valuable merchandise for resale, but as part of a systematic campaign to gain control over the economic infrastructure that supported Alaska's remote communities through intimidation, violence, and strategic destruction of the businesses that served as lifelines for populations that existed beyond the protective reach of conventional law enforcement and emergency services that urban residents took for granted. Evidence found at the scene suggested that the robbery had been planned for months, with the perpetrators conducting detailed surveillance of the trading post's operations, customer patterns, and security measures, while developing comprehensive intelligence about the role that Morrison's business played in the economic survival of Alaska's remote communities. The planning had been thorough and professional, suggesting involvement by individuals with military or law enforcement training in intelligence gathering and tactical operations. The perpetrators knew Morrison's daily schedule, understood which customers were most vulnerable to intimidation and violence, and had identified the optimal timing for their operation when their activities would be least likely to be detected or interrupted by law enforcement patrols or community members who might interfere with their systematic destruction of the economic relationships that sustained Alaska's remote populations. The criminal organization behind the robbery operated on the principle that remote communities were vulnerable to economic warfare, conducted by individuals who understood how to exploit the logistical challenges that kept isolated populations supplied with essential goods and services that made survival possible in Alaska's harsh environment. By controlling access to supplies, weapons, communication equipment, and other necessities, they could effectively control entire communities without ever firing a shot or making direct threats against specific individuals. The systematic theft of customer records and regional maps suggested that the perpetrators intended to use Morrison's business relationships and geographical knowledge to expand their control over other trading posts, supply stores, and service providers that served Alaska's remote communities. They were essentially conducting an economic conquest that would give them power over the survival of thousands of people who depended on businesses like Morrison's for access to the outside world and the supplies necessary for life in Alaska's interior. Captain Arthur Rodriguez of the Alaska Bureau of Investigation took command of what became known as the Trading Post War, recognizing that the Morrison robbery represented the beginning of a systematic campaign by criminal organizations to gain control over the economic infrastructure of Alaska's remote communities through intimidation, violence, and strategic destruction of the businesses that served as lifelines for isolated populations who had few alternatives and limited ability to resist organized criminal pressure. This isn't random crime motivated by immediate need or opportunity, Rodriguez explained during a briefing with federal agencies brought in to address the scope of the criminal enterprise that was targeting Alaska's most vulnerable communities. This is economic terrorism designed to make remote communities dependent on criminal organizations for essential supplies and services that they can't obtain elsewhere. They're using isolation and geographical challenges as weapons against people who choose to live beyond the reach of conventional protection and law enforcement support. The investigation expanded when similar attacks occurred at trading posts and supply stores across Alaska's interior, all displaying the same characteristics that had been observed at Morrison's: systematic ransacking that suggested professional planning and execution, selective theft of items that could be used to supply future criminal operations or gather intelligence about community vulnerabilities, and the deliberate terrorizing of customers who were left alive to spread word about what happened to communities that didn't cooperate with the new economic arrangements being imposed by organized criminal forces. The pattern revealed a criminal organization that combined detailed knowledge of Alaska's remote communities with sophisticated understanding of how to exploit logistical vulnerabilities for criminal advantage while maintaining operational security that made detection and prosecution extremely difficult for law enforcement agencies with limited resources and personnel. The perpetrators knew which communities were most isolated, which businesses were most critical to local survival, and which individuals could be intimidated into cooperation or eliminated if they proved resistant to criminal control. Federal investigators working to trace the criminal organization discovered connections to Harold Bradley, a former military logistics specialist who had been dishonorably discharged from the Army 5 years earlier, following allegations of theft and black market operations during overseas deployments, where he had learned to exploit supply chain vulnerabilities for personal profit. Bradley had used his military experience in supply chain management and tactical operations to identify opportunities for criminal enterprises in Alaska's remote areas, where law enforcement presence was minimal and community resistance could be overcome through systematic intimidation and violence. Bradley's operation combined military-style planning and execution with criminal entrepreneurship that treated Alaska's remote communities as territories to be conquered and controlled rather than places where people lived and worked and raised families in pursuit of the independence and self-reliance that had drawn them to Alaska's frontier lifestyle. His criminal organization recruited former military personnel who brought tactical skills and logistical expertise to operations that were planned and executed with the precision of military campaigns designed to achieve strategic objectives through overwhelming force and systematic intimidation. The investigation revealed that Bradley had been operating from a base established in an abandoned mining camp that had been converted into a military-style compound equipped with sophisticated communications equipment, weapons caches, and detailed maps of every remote community in Alaska's interior that might be vulnerable to economic warfare and criminal control. The facility served as headquarters for what Bradley called his resource acquisition operations, treating Alaska's remote communities as targets for systematic economic conquest rather than places where American citizens lived and worked in pursuit of legitimate livelihoods. When Alaska state troopers and federal agents moved to arrest Bradley and his associates, they discovered that the compound had been fortified and defended by individuals with military training who were prepared to resist law enforcement with weapons and tactics that exceeded anything typically encountered in civilian criminal investigations. The compound revealed the scope of Bradley's ambitions and the systematic nature of his assault on Alaska's remote communities through economic warfare, designed to establish criminal control over essential services and supplies. Computer files found at the compound contained detailed intelligence assessments of over 200 trading posts, supply stores, and other businesses that served isolated populations throughout Alaska's interior, along with comprehensive plans for gaining control over each target through intimidation, economic warfare, or direct military-style assault conducted by personnel with tactical training and sophisticated weapons. Bradley had identified every critical business that supported Alaska's remote communities and had developed specific strategies for neutralizing or controlling each one. The intelligence files contained psychological profiles of business owners like Ray Morrison, identifying their personal vulnerabilities, family relationships, and community connections that could be exploited to force cooperation with criminal demands or eliminate resistance through targeted violence against individuals who refused to accept the new economic arrangements being imposed by Bradley's organization. Alaska State Trooper Raymond Miller had been investigating missing persons cases in Alaska's seasonal work camps for 6 years when the call came in from the Glacier Bay Cannery at 2:47 a.m. on a foggy September morning in 2023, when the salmon runs were ending and the temporary workers who followed Alaska's seasonal industries were beginning their annual migration to winter jobs in warmer climates or unemployment lines in their home states, carrying with them memories of wilderness experiences that would sustain them through urban winters and dreams of returning to Alaska's frontier lifestyle that promised freedom from the constraints of conventional employment in America's increasingly regulated and monitored economy. The voice on the radio belonged to Betty Harrison, the cannery supervisor whose reputation for toughness and competence had been earned through 20 years of managing seasonal workers in conditions that tested both physical endurance and psychological resilience. But Miller could barely recognize the strong, no-nonsense woman he'd known for years as someone who could handle any crisis that Alaska's wilderness could produce. Her voice was shaking so badly that dispatch had to ask her to repeat her report 3 times before they could understand what she was trying to communicate about the discovery that would launch one of Alaska's most disturbing kidnapping investigations. The fog that morning was so thick that it seemed to absorb sound, creating an eerie silence that made even familiar voices seem distant and distorted, while reducing visibility to a few feet and transforming the familiar landscape around Glacier Bay into something alien and threatening that challenged the sense of direction and spatial orientation that workers depended on for safety in an industrial environment where machinery and processing equipment could cause serious injuries or death if operated without proper attention to safety procedures that required clear visibility and constant awareness of surrounding dangers. "We found Sharon's bunk," Harrison managed to say through what sounded like shock, terror, or the kind of psychological damage that came from discovering evidence of human cruelty that exceeded normal expectations about criminal behavior in Alaska's typically peaceful work camps. "But Sharon ain't been seen for 3 weeks now, and there's things in that bunk that suggest she didn't leave on her own like we thought when she stopped showing up for shifts. Things that suggest someone took her. Things that suggest whoever took her wanted us to know exactly what they were capable of doing to people who work in these camps." Miller understood that the discovery had implications that went far beyond a single missing person case, potentially revealing systematic predation targeting Alaska's most vulnerable populations in locations where disappearances might not be noticed or reported for weeks or months, due to the transient nature of seasonal employment and the isolation that characterized work camps scattered across Alaska's vast wilderness, where conventional law enforcement protection was limited by geographical challenges and resource constraints that made comprehensive coverage virtually impossible. The Glacier Bay Cannery employed over 400 seasonal workers during the peak salmon processing season, housing them in dormitory-style buildings that provided basic accommodation for people who came to Alaska from across the United States, and occasionally from foreign countries, to make money during the brief window when fish processing plants needed maximum labor to handle the harvest that sustained coastal communities throughout Alaska's long winter months, when other forms of employment were scarce or non-existent in remote areas. The seasonal workers represented a diverse population of individuals seeking different things from their Alaska experience. College students earning tuition money for expensive educational programs, retirees seeking adventure and supplemental income for fixed budgets that didn't cover the costs of interesting travel experiences, people escaping personal problems or legal troubles in their home states and looking for fresh starts in locations where their past history wouldn't follow them, and individuals who followed seasonal work across the country as a lifestyle choice that provided freedom from conventional employment relationships and the opportunity to experience America's wilderness areas while earning enough money to sustain their nomadic existence. This transient nature made the seasonal worker population perfect targets for predators who understood that someone could vanish from a work camp without anyone noticing for weeks or months, and that even when disappearances were eventually reported, the investigation would be complicated by the lack of stable relationships or community connections that usually helped law enforcement track missing individuals and determine whether disappearances were voluntary departures or the result of criminal activity requiring immediate intervention. Miller had investigated dozens of cases where seasonal workers had simply vanished from their jobs, sometimes leaving personal belongings behind that suggested hasty departure, sometimes taking everything with them in ways that indicated planned departure, but always leaving questions about whether their disappearance was voluntary relocation to other employment opportunities or the result of criminal activity that might have claimed other victims whose disappearances hadn't been reported due to the isolation and transient relationships that characterized Alaska's seasonal work industry. The remote locations of many work camps and the temporary nature of worker relationships made investigation extremely difficult, even under optimal conditions, while the lack of permanent community connections meant that missing persons cases often went unnoticed until employment contracts expired and workers failed to return home or contact family members who expected regular communication during Alaska employment periods that typically lasted several months in locations where conventional communication was often limited or unreliable. Sharon Williams was a 28-year-old college graduate from Minnesota who had come to Alaska to earn money for graduate school while experiencing the adventure of working in one of America's last frontiers, seeking the kind of authentic outdoor experience that couldn't be obtained through conventional tourism or urban employment opportunities that provided financial security but limited personal growth and adventure. She was reliable, responsible, and had maintained regular contact with her family through satellite phone and internet services available at the cannery until 3 weeks earlier, when her communications had stopped abruptly without explanation or warning that might indicate personal problems or planned changes to her employment situation. Sharon's family had begun calling the cannery when they didn't receive her weekly phone calls, but her disappearance hadn't been reported to law enforcement immediately because seasonal worker turnover was common and supervisors assumed she had found other employment or decided to return home early due to the physical demands of cannery work or dissatisfaction with living conditions that many workers found more challenging than they had anticipated when they accepted employment in Alaska's remote locations. What Harrison had found in Sharon's bunk would haunt Miller for the rest of his career in law enforcement and reveal the existence of a predator who had been systematically targeting Alaska's seasonal workers for purposes that exceeded anything in his experience with criminal behavior or human psychology. Personal items arranged in patterns that suggested someone had been studying Sharon's habits, preferences, and daily routines with obsessive attention to detail that indicated prolonged surveillance and systematic documentation of her activities, relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities. Photographs of Sharon taken without her knowledge during work hours, break periods, and even while she was sleeping in what should have been the privacy of her dormitory accommodation, revealing that someone had gained unauthorized access to worker housing and had been conducting systematic surveillance of Sharon's private activities while documenting her daily routines and personal habits for purposes that remained unclear but obviously involved criminal intent that threatened not just Sharon, but potentially other seasonal workers who might be under similar surveillance. The photographs showed Sharon in various states of undress and vulnerability, apparently taken over several weeks by someone who had regular access to worker housing and who understood the schedules and security procedures that governed cannery operations. The systematic nature of the surveillance suggested professional-level planning and execution that exceeded typical stalking behavior and indicated involvement by individuals with sophisticated knowledge of security systems and surveillance techniques. But the most chilling discovery was a detailed journal documenting Sharon's daily routine, her friendships and relationships with other workers, her plans for returning home and continuing her education, her fears and concerns expressed in private conversations that someone had been listening to and recording without her knowledge or consent. The journal was written in someone else's handwriting and revealed that Sharon had been under systematic observation and psychological analysis by individuals who understood how to identify and exploit personal vulnerabilities for criminal purposes. The journal entries revealed intimate knowledge of Sharon's family relationships, financial situation, educational goals, and personal insecurities that could only have been obtained through prolonged surveillance and systematic intelligence gathering that included monitoring her personal communications, observing her social interactions, and possibly infiltrating her social circle with individuals who gained her trust while reporting her private information to criminal organizations that specialized in targeting vulnerable populations. The surveillance had been comprehensive and sophisticated, revealing knowledge of Sharon's work schedule, living arrangements, transportation patterns, and social relationships that would have required coordinated effort by multiple individuals with access to different aspects of her daily life in the work camp. Someone had been conducting what amounted to a military-style intelligence operation, targeting a young woman whose only crime was seeking adventure and financial independence through seasonal employment in Alaska's wilderness. The investigation revealed that Sharon Williams was just one of at least 12 seasonal workers who had disappeared from Alaskan work camps over the past 2 years, all under circumstances that suggested systematic predation rather than voluntary departure or accidental death in Alaska's dangerous wilderness environment. The disappearances had occurred at different camps across Alaska, but the pattern was remarkably consistent in ways that suggested coordinated activity by criminal organizations that understood seasonal work operations and had developed systematic methods for identifying and targeting vulnerable individuals. Each missing worker had been isolated individuals without strong family ties or community connections that would prompt immediate concern about their welfare, characteristics that made them perfect targets for predators who understood that their disappearances might not be noticed or reported for weeks or months after they vanished from their employment locations. Each had been living in dormitory-style housing where privacy was limited, and personal security depended on trust among workers who barely knew each other, and supervisors whose primary concern was maintaining production schedules rather than monitoring worker welfare. The missing workers had all disappeared during periods when work camp populations were changing due to seasonal transitions, contract completions, or voluntary departures by workers who had completed their planned employment periods, providing cover for criminal activities that might otherwise have been noticed by supervisors or coworkers who were familiar with normal patterns of worker departure and employment termination procedures. Federal investigators brought in to coordinate the missing seasonal worker case discovered evidence of a sophisticated criminal operation that exploited the vulnerabilities of Alaska's temporary labor force through systematic surveillance, intelligence gathering, and coordinated abduction activities that took advantage of the isolation and transient relationships that characterized seasonal work environments where conventional security measures and law enforcement protection were limited by geographical and economic constraints. The investigation revealed connections to Arthur Morrison, a 51-year-old former camp manager who had been working in Alaska's seasonal industries for over 15 years, moving between different camps and different employers in ways that made it difficult for any single organization to develop a complete picture of his activities or his interactions with the workers under his supervision. Morrison's employment history showed a pattern of short-term positions at different camps, suggesting either professional instability or deliberate strategy to avoid long-term scrutiny of his activities and relationships with seasonal workers. Morrison had used his legitimate position in camp management to gain access to worker housing, personnel files, and scheduling information that allowed him to identify vulnerable individuals and study their habits, relationships, and psychological characteristics before targeting them for abduction and whatever criminal purposes he had developed for seasonal workers who could disappear without immediate law enforcement attention or community concern about their welfare. His knowledge of camp operations and worker routines had provided perfect cover for activities that would have been highly suspicious if conducted by someone without legitimate reasons for being in restricted areas of worker housing or having access to personal information about individual employees whose privacy should have been protected by employment regulations and basic human decency that governed relationships between supervisors and workers in legitimate employment situations. Morrison's background revealed patterns of behavior that should have raised concerns among employers if proper background checks and reference verification had been conducted before hiring him for positions that involved supervision of vulnerable populations in isolated locations where abuse could occur without detection or intervention by law enforcement agencies or regulatory organizations responsible for protecting worker safety and welfare. When Alaska state troopers executed a search warrant at Morrison's residence near Juneau, they discovered evidence of an operation that had been targeting seasonal workers for over 5 years, using surveillance equipment and intelligence-gathering techniques that exceeded anything typically associated with conventional criminal enterprises, targeting transient populations for robbery, assault, or other crimes that might be expected in work camp environments, where valuable personal property and cash payments made workers attractive targets for opportunistic criminals. Hidden cameras and recording equipment had been used to conduct systematic surveillance of workers in multiple camps, allowing Morrison to document their personal activities, relationships, and daily routines while gathering intelligence that would facilitate future criminal activities targeting individuals who met his specific criteria for victimization. The surveillance equipment was sophisticated and professionally installed, suggesting either military or law enforcement training in intelligence-gathering techniques and surveillance operations. Detailed files contained psychological profiles and vulnerability assessments for hundreds of individuals who had worked under Morrison's supervision over the years, revealing a systematic approach to identifying and cataloging potential victims based on their personal characteristics, family relationships, financial situations, and psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited for criminal purposes that remained unclear until investigators discovered Morrison's private facility. But the most horrifying discovery was Morrison's converted warehouse facility, where he had been holding abducted seasonal workers while conducting what he called isolation experiments, designed to study the psychological effects of complete separation from normal social contact and support systems that sustained human psychological health and social functioning under normal circumstances. The facility had been designed and constructed to replicate work camp conditions while allowing Morrison complete control over every aspect of his victim's environment and experiences. The warehouse contained cells that had been constructed to simulate dormitory housing while incorporating sophisticated monitoring and control systems that allowed Morrison to observe and document his victim's behavior under conditions of complete isolation and systematic psychological abuse. The cells were equipped with recording equipment that captured audio and video documentation of his victim's psychological deterioration, while he conducted experiments designed to test human responses to prolonged captivity and systematic abuse. 7 of the missing seasonal workers were found alive but severely traumatized in Morrison's isolation facility, displaying signs of prolonged psychological abuse that had been designed to break down their resistance and make them completely dependent on their captor for basic needs like food, water, human contact, and information about the outside world. The survivors described experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about human resilience and the effects of prolonged isolation combined with systematic psychological manipulation and abuse. Morrison's journals revealed a disturbed worldview that viewed seasonal workers as perfect subjects for experiments in human psychology and behavioral modification, treating them as research subjects whose suffering provided data for his study of human responses to extreme social deprivation, isolation, and systematic abuse conducted under controlled conditions that allowed him to document psychological deterioration while testing various methods of breaking down human resistance to authority and control. They came to Alaska seeking adventure and independence. Morrison wrote in one journal entry that would later be used as evidence in his prosecution for kidnapping, false imprisonment, and systematic abuse of vulnerable populations. But they found something much more valuable when they encountered my program. They found the ultimate adventure, the complete experience of human vulnerability and dependence that taught them things about themselves and human nature that they never could have discovered through conventional employment or normal social relationships. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that Morrison viewed his victims not as human beings deserving of respect, protection, and basic human rights, but as experimental subjects whose suffering and psychological deterioration provided valuable data for his research into human psychology under extreme conditions that couldn't be studied through legal research methods or ethical experimental procedures that required informed consent and protection of research subjects from harm. Alaska State Trooper Margaret Foster had handled identity theft cases during her 12 years of law enforcement service in communities where the intersection of traditional indigenous culture and modern bureaucratic systems created unique vulnerabilities that criminals could exploit. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the systematic cultural destruction she discovered when she responded to a call from the Tanacross Native Corporation offices on a bitter January morning in 2023. When the temperature hadn't risen above -20 in 3 weeks, and the aurora borealis seemed to mock human suffering with its relentless beauty across skies that held secrets older than recorded history, and witnessed the slow erosion of indigenous identity through bureaucratic violence that was more devastating than any military conquest. The call came from Joyce Teller, the corporation's administrator, whose voice carried the kind of controlled anger that comes from discovering a violation so profound that simple outrage was inadequate to express the depth of the offense and the systematic nature of the attack on indigenous identity that threatened to destroy cultural connections that had survived centuries of colonization, assimilation policies, and systematic attempts to eliminate indigenous peoples through cultural genocide, disguised as administrative efficiency and bureaucratic modernization. Trooper Foster, we need you here immediately. Someone has been stealing our people's identities, but this isn't ordinary identity theft that can be resolved through credit monitoring and financial protection services. This is something that cuts to the heart of who we are as a people, attacking the very foundations of our existence and our legal recognition as indigenous individuals with specific relationships to ancestral territories and cultural traditions that define our identity and our rights as Alaska Native peoples. Foster had grown up in Alaska and understood the complex relationships between indigenous communities and the state and federal bureaucracies that governed their lives through an intricate web of laws, treaties, and regulations that most outsiders found incomprehensible, but that determined everything from healthcare access and educational opportunities to land rights and resource development decisions that affected the economic survival and cultural continuity of Alaska Native communities throughout the state. The bureaucratic systems that governed indigenous identity in Alaska were more than administrative conveniences. They represented the intersection between traditional cultural relationships that had existed for thousands of years and modern legal structures that determined whether indigenous peoples could maintain access to ancestral territories, traditional resources, healthcare services, educational opportunities, and the economic benefits that came from land claims settlements and resource development agreements negotiated through decades of political struggle and legal advocacy. The Tanacross Native Corporation served as more than just a business entity operating under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. It functioned as the legal mechanism through which the Tanacross people maintained their relationship with territories that had sustained them for countless generations, managing traditional lands while serving as the interface between ancient cultural traditions and modern legal requirements that governed indigenous rights and resources in Alaska's contemporary political and economic systems. The corporation managed not only traditional territories and resource development projects that provided economic opportunities for community members, but also served as the institutional guardian of cultural knowledge, genealogical records, and the complex documentation systems that connected individual identity to ancestral heritage, family relationships, and traditional territories in ways that determined legal standing and cultural legitimacy within both traditional and contemporary indigenous political structures. What Foster discovered at the corporation offices would challenge every assumption she held about identity theft and its potential consequences for communities whose existence depended on maintaining accurate records of membership, ancestry, and cultural relationships that determined everything from healthcare benefits and educational opportunities to land rights and resource access that formed the economic foundation of indigenous community survival in modern Alaska. 17 members of the Tanacross community had reported problems with their identification documents over the past 6 months. But the problems extended far beyond simple credit card fraud, financial theft, or the kind of identity compromise that affected millions of Americans annually through data breaches and criminal exploitation of personal information stored in commercial databases that prioritized convenience over security and treated personal identity as a commodity to be bought, sold, and manipulated for commercial advantage. The identity alterations that had been discovered affected fundamental aspects of indigenous identity that couldn't be restored through conventional identity theft recovery procedures. Someone had been systematically altering official records to change family relationships that determined clan membership and traditional authority structures, modifying birth dates and locations that established connections to specific territories and seasonal resource access patterns, and even reassigning traditional names and cultural identities that carried spiritual significance and determined individual roles within traditional social structures that had governed indigenous communities for thousands of years. The perpetrator had gained unauthorized access to databases maintained by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Indian Health Service, Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act corporations, tribal governments, and even historical church records, dating back over a century that contained genealogical information essential for establishing indigenous identity and community membership. The alterations were subtle but devastating, changing details that might seem insignificant to outsiders, but that formed the foundation of indigenous identity and community belonging in ways that affected every aspect of individual and collective existence. They're not just stealing our names and social security numbers, Joyce Teller explained as she led Foster through files that documented the scope of the cultural assault that had been conducted against her community through systematic manipulation of identity records. They're stealing our history, our family relationships, our connection to the land and to each other through alterations that destroy the documented proof of who we are and where we come from. They're trying to erase us as a people by destroying the records that prove our identity and our rights as indigenous peoples. The bureaucratic systems that maintained indigenous identity in Alaska represented the intersection between traditional knowledge systems that relied on oral history, family relationships, and cultural transmission of identity information, and modern documentation requirements that translated traditional relationships into legal categories that could be recognized and protected by contemporary political and legal institutions that operated according to European-derived concepts of identity, property, and legal standing. The investigation revealed that someone with sophisticated knowledge of indigenous identity systems had been conducting a systematic campaign to disrupt the legal and cultural foundations of Alaska Native communities through manipulation of the documentation systems that connected individuals to specific communities, ancestral territories, and cultural traditions. The perpetrator understood that indigenous identity in Alaska depended on complex documentation that could be manipulated by someone with sufficient knowledge and access to the multiple databases and record systems that maintained different aspects of indigenous legal and cultural identity. Evidence found during the initial investigation suggested that the identity alterations were part of a larger scheme designed to create confusion about community membership and resource rights that could be exploited for economic advantage by individuals or organizations seeking access to benefits, resources, and legal standing that belong to legitimate community members. By disrupting the records that established indigenous identity and community relationships, the perpetrator was creating opportunities to claim healthcare benefits, educational resources, land rights, and economic benefits that were legally reserved for indigenous peoples. The case became increasingly complex as investigators discovered that the identity theft was being conducted by someone within the indigenous community itself, someone who understood traditional relationships, cultural protocols, and bureaucratic procedures well enough to know exactly which alterations would cause maximum disruption to community structure while creating opportunities for personal gain through fraudulent claims to indigenous identity and benefits that required specific documentation of ancestry, community membership, and cultural relationships. Federal investigators brought in to address the scope of the identity theft discovered evidence of an operation that had been targeting Alaska Native communities for over 3 years, using inside knowledge of traditional social structures, bureaucratic procedures, and the vulnerabilities created by the intersection between oral traditions and written documentation requirements that governed indigenous identity in contemporary legal and political systems that often failed to understand or accommodate traditional indigenous concepts of identity and community membership. The investigation led to Ruth Patterson, a 45-year-old former tribal administrator who had been dismissed from her position with the Tanacross Native Corporation 2 years earlier, following allegations of financial misconduct and abuse of her access to sensitive community records that contained genealogical information, traditional knowledge, and documentation of family relationships that formed the foundation of indigenous identity and community structure within traditional and contemporary political systems. Patterson's background revealed someone who had used her legitimate position within indigenous governmental and corporate structures to gain detailed knowledge of identity systems, traditional relationships, and bureaucratic procedures before turning that knowledge into a weapon against the very communities she had once served. Exploiting her understanding of indigenous identity systems to conduct systematic cultural destruction while profiting from the sale of fraudulent indigenous identities to non-native individuals seeking access to benefits and opportunities reserved for indigenous peoples. Patterson's criminal operation combined sophisticated understanding of bureaucratic procedures with intimate knowledge of traditional community relationships, genealogical connections, and cultural protocols that allowed her to target specific individuals whose identity alterations would cause maximum disruption to family structures, traditional authority systems, and community governance, while creating optimal opportunities for fraudulent exploitation of indigenous benefits and resources by non-native individuals willing to pay for access to indigenous legal status. Her activities threatened not just individual victims whose identities had been altered or stolen, but the entire social and cultural fabric that held indigenous communities together through traditional relationships that had been disrupted by systematic manipulation of the documentation systems that translated traditional identity concepts into legal categories, recognized by contemporary governmental and corporate institutions that administered indigenous affairs and resource management in Alaska. When Alaska state troopers executed a search warrant at Patterson's residence in Fairbanks, they discovered evidence of a systematic campaign to destroy indigenous identity documentation across multiple Alaska Native communities, while simultaneously creating fraudulent indigenous identities for non-native clients who were willing to pay substantial sums for access to healthcare benefits, educational opportunities, legal advantages, and resource rights that were legally reserved for indigenous peoples under federal and state laws protecting indigenous rights and resources. Computer files contained detailed genealogical information, traditional family relationships, and cultural connections that Patterson had been using to plan identity alterations that would maximize social disruption within targeted communities while creating optimal opportunities for selling fraudulent indigenous identities to non-native individuals who understood that indigenous legal status provided access to benefits, resources, and legal protections unavailable to the general population, but who lacked legitimate ancestral connections to indigenous communities. The most disturbing discovery was Patterson's correspondence with individuals outside Alaska who were interested in acquiring false indigenous identities for purposes that ranged from claiming healthcare benefits through Indian Health Service programs to obtaining legal advantages in court proceedings business transactions, and government contracting opportunities that provided preferences for indigenous-owned businesses and individuals who could demonstrate legitimate indigenous identity through proper documentation of ancestry and community membership. Patterson had been selling fraudulent indigenous identities to non-native individuals while simultaneously destroying the legitimate identities of actual community members, creating a dual system of cultural destruction and identity fraud that generated substantial profits while systematically undermining the legal and cultural foundations that allowed indigenous communities to maintain their distinct existence and protect their rights as indigenous peoples under federal and state laws governing indigenous affairs. She wasn't just committing identity theft in any conventional sense, explained FBI agent Virginia Walsh, who specialized in crimes targeting indigenous communities and understood the unique vulnerabilities created by the intersection between traditional identity systems and modern bureaucratic requirements. Patterson was conducting cultural genocide, using her knowledge of traditional relationships and bureaucratic procedures to systematically destroy the documented connections that allow indigenous communities to maintain their legal existence and cultural continuity across generations. Patterson's files revealed the comprehensive scope of her operation and the systematic nature of her assault on indigenous identity systems that had been designed to survive exactly this kind of bureaucratic violence through redundant documentation, traditional knowledge preservation, and community-based verification systems that she had learned to circumvent through her legitimate employment with indigenous governmental and corporate institutions that trusted her with access to sensitive cultural and genealogical information. The identity alterations had created chaos in affected communities, as families discovered that their documented relationships had been changed in ways that threatened their access to traditional territories, their eligibility for health care and educational benefits, and even their legal standing as members of their own communities. Some individuals found that their cultural identities had been completely erased from official records, making it difficult or impossible to prove their connection to ancestral lands, traditional resources, and cultural practices that defined their existence as indigenous peoples. The systematic nature of the alterations suggested that Patterson had been working from detailed knowledge of traditional social structures, family relationships, and cultural protocols that allowed her to identify which changes would cause maximum disruption to community functioning, while creating optimal opportunities for fraudulent exploitation by non-native individuals seeking access to indigenous benefits and resources through purchased false identities that appeared legitimate to bureaucratic systems that relied on documentation rather than traditional verification methods. During interrogation, Patterson showed no remorse for the cultural destruction she had caused, instead expressing resentment toward the communities that had dismissed her from her administrative position and satisfaction with her ability to disrupt the systems that maintained indigenous identity and community structure through systematic manipulation of documentation that governed legal recognition of indigenous identity and rights under contemporary political and legal systems. They thought they could get rid of me and continue operating like nothing happened, Patterson told investigators with the cold calculation that characterized her entire approach to cultural destruction and systematic identity fraud. I showed them that their precious identity systems could be turned against them by someone who understood how they really worked, someone who knew where the vulnerabilities were and how to exploit them for maximum impact. I proved that their community connections were just paperwork that could be changed by anyone with sufficient access and motivation to understand the systems they depended on. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that Patterson viewed indigenous identity as a form of unearned privilege that could and should be redistributed through bureaucratic manipulation, rather than preserved and protected as the foundation of distinct peoples with unique relationships to ancestral territories, traditional resources, and cultural practices that had developed over thousands of years of continuous occupation and sustainable resource management in Alaska's challenging environment. Alaska State Trooper Shirley Watson received the call at 3:15 a.m. on a November night when the temperature had dropped to minus 35 degrees, and the aurora borealis painted the frozen landscape in colors that seemed to pulse with an intelligence older and more patient than human understanding, while the village of Chalkitsik lay buried under snowdrifts that isolated the community from the outside world for months at a time, and left its residents dependent on each other for survival in conditions that tested both human endurance and community bonds forged by generations of shared hardship in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The voice on the radio belonged to Harold Tetzloff, the village public safety officer from Chalkitsik, whose steady presence had helped maintain order and resolve conflicts in a community where traditional indigenous governance systems intersected with modern law enforcement requirements in ways that required deep understanding of both cultural traditions and contemporary legal procedures. Watson could hear something in Tetzloff's normally confident tone that suggested this wasn't going to be a routine call about illegal alcohol sales in one of Alaska's dry villages, but something far more sinister that challenged his understanding of human nature and criminal behavior. "Trooper Watson, I need you in Chalkitsik as soon as weather permits aircraft operations," Tetzloff said, his voice carrying undertones of something that might have been horror, disbelief, or the kind of psychological shock that came from discovering evidence of systematic cruelty that exceeded normal expectations of criminal behavior, even in communities where alcohol-related violence was tragically common. "We've got a situation with bootlegging, but it's not what you'd expect from normal illegal alcohol operations. People are dying, and they're dying in ways that don't make sense unless someone's been deliberately poisoning the alcohol supply. I think we're dealing with systematic murder disguised as bootlegging activity." Watson had been patrolling Alaska's bush communities for 9 years, long enough to understand that bootlegging in dry villages represented more than just criminal enterprise motivated by profit. It constituted a form of cultural warfare that exploited historical trauma, systemic alcoholism, and community desperation to destroy indigenous communities from within while generating enormous profits for criminals who understood how to weaponize addiction and cultural disruption for economic advantage that came at the cost of human lives and community destruction. Many Alaska Native villages had voted to prohibit alcohol sales, importation, and possession in community-wide decisions that reflected desperate attempts to address addiction problems that had devastated families, destroyed traditional social structures, and undermined cultural continuity for generations since first contact with European colonizers and American settlers who had used alcohol as a tool of cultural destruction and economic exploitation that continued to affect indigenous communities throughout Alaska and other regions where indigenous peoples struggled to maintain traditional lifeways in the face of ongoing colonization and cultural suppression. The decision to establish dry village status represented more than legal prohibition. It embodied community determination to break cycles of addiction, violence, and cultural destruction that alcohol had brought to indigenous communities through centuries of exploitation by traders, missionaries, government agents, and other outside influences that had used alcohol to facilitate land theft, cultural suppression, and the systematic destruction of traditional indigenous governance systems, spiritual practices, and social structures that had sustained Alaska Native peoples for thousands of years. But the dry village policies that represented hope for cultural survival and community healing also created opportunities for criminal exploitation by bootleggers who understood that prohibition created artificial scarcity and premium pricing for alcohol in communities where addiction and desperation made people willing to pay exorbitant prices for illegal alcohol that was often dangerous, contaminated, or deliberately adulterated with toxic substances that could cause serious health problems or death. But that increased profits for criminals who viewed indigenous communities as exploitable markets rather than human populations deserving of respect and protection. The flight to Chalkitsik would take Watson over hundreds of miles of wilderness that stretched beyond the horizon like a frozen ocean broken only by occasional villages, hunting camps, or mining operations that represented humanity's fragile foothold in country that could kill the unprepared in dozens of different ways through exposure, starvation, predation, or simply the psychological isolation that came from existing in landscapes where human presence was so minimal that individuals could disappear without trace, and their fate might never be known by anyone. The Arctic landscape visible from Watson's aircraft was simultaneously beautiful and hostile, a reminder that survival in Alaska's interior depended on respect for natural forces that were utterly indifferent to human presence and that could eliminate entire communities through weather events, resource depletion, or environmental changes that made traditional lifeways impossible to maintain without outside support systems that might not be available during emergencies or seasonal supply disruptions that could last for months. Chalk-Yitzhak was home to fewer than 100 people, most of them Alaska Native families who had chosen to maintain traditional subsistence lifestyles in one of the most remote locations in North America, where survival depended on hunting, fishing, gathering, and traditional resource management practices that had sustained indigenous populations for thousands of years through careful adaptation to seasonal cycles and environmental changes that required intimate knowledge of ecological relationships and resource availability patterns. The village had been officially dry for over 15 years following a community decision made by residents who understood that alcohol had been used as a weapon against their people since first contact with outside cultures, and who recognized that maintaining sobriety was essential for cultural survival, family stability, and the preservation of traditional knowledge systems that depended on clear thinking, community cooperation, and intergenerational transmission of cultural practices that could be disrupted or destroyed by alcohol abuse and the violence it generated within indigenous communities. What Watson found in Chalk-Yitzhak would challenge everything she thought she understood about bootlegging and the psychology of individuals who profited from the destruction of indigenous communities through systematic exploitation of addiction, cultural trauma, and the isolation that made remote villages vulnerable to criminal operations that could continue for extended periods without detection by law enforcement agencies with limited resources and personnel spread across vast geographical areas. 7 villagers had died over the past month from what initially appeared to be alcohol poisoning resulting from consumption of contaminated moonshine or industrial alcohol that had been illegally imported and sold to community members who were desperate for alcohol despite the community's dry status and their understanding of the health risks associated with consuming unregulated alcohol products of unknown origin and potentially dangerous chemical composition. But the circumstances of their deaths suggested something far more sinister than accidental contamination, or the kind of tragic poisoning incidents that occasionally occurred when bootleggers cut corners on safety procedures or used industrial chemicals to increase alcohol content without understanding the health consequences of consuming products that were never intended for human consumption, and that could cause blindness, organ failure, or death, even in relatively small quantities. The victims had all been community leaders who had supported the village's dry status and had been active in efforts to prevent bootleggers from bringing alcohol into the community through education programs, traditional healing approaches to addiction treatment, and community organizing activities designed to strengthen cultural identity and provide alternatives to alcohol abuse that addressed underlying social problems contributing to addiction and self-destructive behavior within indigenous communities. Each victim had consumed alcohol that contained lethal levels of methanol, a form of alcohol that causes blindness and death even in relatively small quantities, but that can be difficult to detect in bootleg liquor without sophisticated laboratory testing equipment that was unavailable in remote villages where healthcare resources were limited and chemical analysis capabilities were virtually non-existent. The methanol poisoning had been systematic and precise, suggesting deliberate murder rather than accidental contamination or quality control failures in illegal alcohol production. Village Public Safety Officer Tetzloff had been documenting the deaths and had noticed patterns that suggested the methanol poisoning wasn't accidental contamination, resulting from incompetent or careless bootlegging operations, but deliberate murder designed to eliminate community opposition to illegal alcohol importation, while terrorizing the remaining population into accepting bootlegging activities as an inevitable part of village life that couldn't be resisted or eliminated through community action or law enforcement intervention. "Someone's systematically targeting our strongest people," Tetzloff explained as he led Watson through the community center where the bodies had been discovered after family members found them dead in their homes, following what appeared to be normal social drinking that had turned deadly due to deliberate poisoning that violated every principle of indigenous hospitality and community solidarity. The folks who died were all involved in efforts to keep bootleggers out of the village, all active in community organizing and education programs designed to address alcohol problems. They were the ones who organized community meetings about maintaining dry status, who reported suspicious activity to law enforcement, who tried to help young people understand the historical and cultural reasons why alcohol prohibition was important for community survival and cultural continuity. The investigation revealed that someone with detailed knowledge of village social structure, traditional leadership patterns, and community governance systems had been conducting a systematic assassination campaign designed to destroy community resistance to bootlegging operations while demonstrating to other community members what would happen to anyone who opposed the importation and sale of illegal alcohol in their community. The perpetrator understood which individuals were most influential in maintaining the village's dry status and had developed methods for targeting them through exploitation of cultural obligations and traditional social responsibilities. Evidence found during the investigation suggested that the bootlegger had been using traditional social gatherings, ceremonial occasions, and community celebrations to distribute the poisoned alcohol to specific individuals who had been marked for elimination because of their leadership roles in maintaining community resistance to illegal alcohol operations. The perpetrator exploited cultural protocols around hospitality, sharing, and traditional social relationships to ensure that victims would consume the lethal alcohol without suspicion or resistance that might have saved their lives. The use of traditional cultural occasions for systematic murder represented a particularly cruel form of cultural warfare that turned indigenous hospitality customs and community solidarity against the very people those traditions were meant to protect and strengthen. The investigation led to Charles Morrison, a 48-year-old Alaska Native man who had grown up in Chalk Yitzhak, but had left the village in his 20s to work in Fairbanks and Anchorage, where he had developed addictions to alcohol and methamphetamine while losing connection to traditional cultural values and community relationships that had once provided meaning and direction for his life. Morrison had returned to Chalk Yitzhak claiming to want to reconnect with his cultural heritage and help address social problems that affected the village. But investigators discovered that he had actually been recruited by criminal organizations that specialized in exploiting indigenous communities for drug and alcohol distribution networks. When Alaska State Troopers executed a search warrant at Morrison's cabin on the outskirts of Chalk Yitzhak, they discovered evidence of a sophisticated operation that combined traditional cultural knowledge with modern criminal techniques to create bootlegging methods that were far more effective and destructive than conventional alcohol smuggling operations. Morrison had been using his cultural background and family connections to identify community leaders who posed threats to bootlegging operations, then systematically targeting them for elimination through poisoned alcohol that was distributed during traditional gatherings. Morrison's journals contained detailed psychological profiles of his intended victims, showing that he had studied their personalities, their commitment to community welfare, and their likely responses to various scenarios designed to lure them into consuming the lethal alcohol. He had specifically targeted individuals known for their dedication to maintaining the village's dry status, understanding that their cultural obligations would compel them to participate in traditional sharing customs even when they suspected danger. During interrogation, Morrison showed no remorse for his crimes, instead expressing resentment toward the community that had rejected him and satisfaction with his ability to exploit traditional customs for criminal purposes. He maintained that his actions were justified because the community leaders had been interfering with progress and keeping people trapped in poverty through their opposition to alcohol importation that could have generated income for the village. The psychological evaluation revealed that Morrison viewed his cultural heritage not as something to be preserved and honored, but as a tool that could be exploited for personal gain and revenge against a community that he blamed for his personal failures. His journals revealed plans to expand his poisoning operation to other dry villages across Alaska, with detailed maps and community intelligence that suggested a systematic campaign of cultural destruction disguised as business enterprise. Morrison was ultimately convicted on multiple federal charges, including murder, conspiracy, and terrorism. His conviction resulted in life imprisonment without possibility of parole, but the damage to Chalkitsik's social fabric proved lasting and devastating. 3 years after Morrison's arrest, the village continues to struggle with the psychological trauma of his betrayal. Community members find it difficult to trust traditional sharing customs, and several families have left Chalkitsik permanently, unable to cope with the memories of leaders who died believing they were participating in cultural traditions that connected them to their ancestors. Trooper Watson still patrols Alaska's bush communities, but she approaches every dry village case with enhanced awareness that the greatest threats to indigenous communities sometimes come from within, from individuals who understand traditional customs well enough to weaponize them against the very people those customs were designed to protect. The memorial erected for Morrison's victims stands at the center of Chalkitsik, bearing the names of the 7 community leaders who died defending their village's dry status. The inscription reads simply, "They died protecting our children's future." But on winter nights, when the aurora borealis dances overhead, Watson sometimes wonders how many other Charles Morrisons are out there, planning to exploit traditional indigenous customs for criminal purposes that threaten the survival of Alaska's most vulnerable communities. The investigation files remain open, with federal agencies monitoring other dry villages for signs of similar operations. But the vastness of Alaska's bush and the sophisticated nature of cultural insider threats make prevention extremely difficult, particularly when the perpetrators understand traditional customs as well as the people they target. Morrison's poisoning operation had been just the beginning of what investigators discovered was a larger network of indigenous individuals who had been recruited to exploit their own communities for outside criminal interests. The betrayal ran deeper than anyone had imagined, challenging fundamental assumptions about community trust and cultural preservation in Alaska's remote indigenous villages. In Chalkitsik, the bottles of poisoned alcohol that Morrison distributed during traditional ceremonies have become symbols of how cultural traditions can be perverted into weapons against the people they were meant to unite. The community continues its dry status, but the innocence and trust that once characterized traditional gatherings died with Morrison's victims, leaving behind a legacy of suspicion that may take generations to heal.